Hi everybody, Ollie here, welcome back to the channel. Once again, another one of those things that happened while I was away and I wasn't around to talk about it at the time. On the 13th of March 2025, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK, announced in Parliament that NHS England, NHSE for the purposes of this video, was to be abolished. I've still not seen a news article yet that explains well what NHS England actually is, or maybe more importantly, what it isn't. NHS England is not the NHS, as most people would think of it. So all clinical care, that is, surgery, surgical operations, GP appointments, pharmacy services, community nursing, like all of this stuff, anything that you would think of when you're thinking about the NHS will continue as normal. That's not what this is about. It's also not the civil service, despite some confusion around that I've seen floating around. NHS England is an arm's length body of the Department of Health and Social Care. In 2013, some of the functions and roles that used to be handled by the Department of Health and Social Care, so part of the government, were moved to NHS England as a separate, politically independent body, right? This was part of the so-called Lansley reforms, Andrew Lansley, and the Health and Social Care Act under the coalition government, which was designed, depending on how you see it, either to shield the sitting health secretary from direct responsibility for NHS crises, or maybe the more charitable interpretation is to allow the NHS to function with more stability beyond short-term political cycles. Because when you're thinking about a public service the size and scale of the NHS, there's a real danger that a government will come in for one cycle, shake everything up, and change the direction of the NHS, and then another party gets voted in, and you then have to spend a huge amount of time and money reorienting the ship in another direction and then another direction. And by at least having a body that is separate from political short-termism, you might get some semblance of a long-term plan. NHSE was, however, clearly going to be in a tough spot no matter which way this was spun, because it was politically independent in theory, but clearly could be under immense pressure from the government anyway, just behind the scenes and not out in public. And fundamentally, it's also not touchable by the voting electorate. The public get no vote on what NHS England is doing, or who works there, or who is running it. So in some sense, a government could exert control and significant influence on NHS England and tell them what the plan was, this is what we want you to do, and then NHS England could do that stuff, but nobody can actually vote NHSE out if you're doing something that the public doesn't like. But then the government can say, well, it's NHS England doing this stuff, it's not us. So although it's supposed to be independent, you've practically just ended up with a government organisation by proxy. So why the big shake-up? Well, Keir Starmer is saying that he wants to bring all of these functions back in-house. NHS England will be folded into the Department of Health and Social Care, putting all of its administrative functions around workforce planning, training and education, large-scale strategy under direct government control again. The official reason that's been given is to cut down on inefficiency and duplication of work, particularly between NHS England and the Department of Health and Social Care, to ensure that the government has more direct oversight of NHS management and save on resource. Now, crucially, what does this mean for doctors? Because that's what people who watch this channel will care about, I assume. At this stage, it's difficult to say exactly what the impact will be, but here are a few key areas that I think we should watch. And the current timeline that's been given is dissolution or abolishment of NHS England by the end of 2027 is my understanding, so about 2 years from now. So the first area is workforce planning and training. NHS England played a very major role in workforce planning and medical education, which is very relevant to us, particularly because of the merger of NHS England and Health Education England, or HEE, in 2023. So all the stuff around delivery of postgraduate medical specialty training in England was managed by Health Education England, so sorting out training numbers and rotations and the structure of training and where people are going. Obviously, if NHS England disappears, in theory, all of that structure around how our entire postgraduate training system, my specialty training, will be affected. Is a shake-up needed? I mean, almost definitely. UK workforce and postgraduate training is broadly considered to be a disaster. However, this may therefore represent an opportunity to increase the quality of things like recruitment, retention, the actual quality and planning of training. Will this lead to better or worse planning? I don't know. My prediction is that just like NHS England engulfed HEE and absorbed it, I suspect that the infrastructure will simply be spat back out when this change comes, because it's only been 2 years. The real risk, I think, here, as often happens with mergers, is they combine two things together. They then have surplus staff, or they want to run it leaner, so they get rid of a load of people, and that will include some of your most experienced and knowledgeable people who understand the system, and you then don't have them anymore when you start to take on new tasks, so you will actually underperform, potentially. That's what I'm very worried about. The second domain is operational management and targets, because NHS England was responsible for setting and enforcing operational targets for NHS trusts, all the different hospitals. With the HSC taking over, we might see more politically driven decision making on targets, again politically, with that vulnerability maybe of short-term pressures that are tied to electoral cycles and vote winning rather than long-term improvement. Political decisions are usually, if not always, to some degree going to be motivated by what wins votes at the ballot box rather than what is necessarily good for the health of the population, and politicians tend to be penny wise but pound foolish, which is not very good when you're dealing with national systems and infrastructure that needs to run continuously for a long time. The third thing we could think about is funding and commissioning, because NHS England actually allocated funding to NHS trusts and commissioned specialist services. If that is now going to be centralised within the government, will those funding decisions become more acutely political, like I just said? Will there be less flexibility for local systems to respond to specific needs of their region? When we're thinking about epidemiology and where certain diseases and pathologies are concentrated within the country, often people's needs are quite different. There are different health needs, different cultural needs, lots of variation. So reduced flexibility to meet those local needs might be something that we see. Number 4 is then the impact on bureaucracy, because the government's argument is that this move will cut red tape. Major reorganisations cause disruption, and previous NHS shake-ups have often led to new layers of bureaucracy developing rather than fewer, because yes, you do cut some red tape, but then you cause problems and you end up plastering over with more short-term solutions. It's possible that in the short term this will create confusion and delays rather than streamlined processes. I just said something similar before, but when HEE was absorbed into NHS England in 2023, a lot of the web pages and materials that you read still reference HEE. That transition has not yet been completed 2 years on. And that's for an organisation which only had one real function, which was to run postgraduate training. Every shake-up, like I said, also means losing your people with institutional memory, either who will be made redundant or go to work elsewhere, either in the public sector or in industry. If you have knowledge gaps that come from that shake-up, you now need to hire back those people, usually at increased cost. This just happened very publicly in America with Elon Musk's Doge stuff. They sacked a load of people in the name of efficiency and then ended up having to pay out the arse to hire them back. Or your people with institutional memory inevitably go to a management consultancy, and then you have to funnel your money from the public sector into the private sector simply to tell you what your own workers already knew before you got rid of them. And again, this is why retention is such a hot button issue in the NHS, and it's terrible that we don't do it better, because that is inevitably what ends up happening. And then number 5 is job losses and restructuring, because the government has said, and this is a big number, that it wants to cut 50% of jobs across NHS England. How this will be implemented remains unclear at this time, but it could mean fewer administrative roles and a shift in those decision-making structures. And in turn, I wonder if that administrative and management burden, particularly as pertains to clinical services, might simply be put back on the plates of doctors, especially at the consultant level, who will no doubt be expected to deal with that additional burden that is now not being done by someone else, while maintaining clinical services which are already struggling. So this may actually impact patient care in a circuitous way. And then just to close this out, we shouldn't forget medical students, because this stuff is obviously the future of what medical students will be dealing with. In short, guys, I think this could have implications for your training, for your placements, and ultimately for workforce planning. So your foundation program, allocations and recruitment, and then your specialty training beyond that. NHS England played a key role in medical education via what was HEE, which set national training priorities and ensured that there were enough, or what it claimed were enough, training posts for resident doctors. If those responsibilities now shift fully back to the DHSC, there may be changes to foundation training allocation, recruitment, funding for postgraduate education, how we're going to maintain our clinician scientist, our academic pathway amidst all this, which is already dysfunctional and not working. All of this stuff is up in the air. At the moment, no major reforms have been announced that give us clarity on any of these things, but any disruption to workforce planning, which is what I'm worried about and interested in, could affect students transitioning into resident doctor roles in the coming years. So definitely keep an eye. And then lastly, what about patients? For the public and patients watching this video, I think that the immediate impact is likely to be fairly minimal, only because GPs, hospitals, pharmacies, community services, they have to continue to operate as normal. However, if the restructuring leads to delays in decision making about how services are going to be run, changes to funding, or increased political interference and short-termism, the long-term effects could actually be quite significant. Because if you get these big key services like cancer surveillance and screening wrong, for example, if you inadequately fund it, or you don't train enough consultant radiologists to report the surveillance scans or to do the diagnostics in the first place, or you lose people in the community to follow up, you can actually have some really bad outcomes that are directly tied to political decision making at the top. The argument ultimately for abolishing NHS England is that it removes duplication and allows the government to take more control. The argument against it, therefore, is that it risks centralising too much power in the hands of politicians, leading short-termism and disruption in an already struggling health service. For now, we simply have to wait and see how this transition will play out. What is certain, though, is that any major change in NHS governance will have ripple effects across the workforce, and those of us who are working in the NHS need to be keeping a really, really close eye on what comes next. So let me know what you think, guys. I hope that has been interesting food for thought and maybe clarified some things. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Take care, and I'll see you next time.